How's it going, everyone? This video is going to be comparing the critic score and audience score for House of the Dragon and for Rings of Power. We're going to see the data from both Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic, and we're going to compare those two critics and audience score for the other shows and movies in those same universes, right? So to Game of Thrones, to the Lord of the Rings film trilogy, and to the Hobbit film trilogy. So the data in front of you right now, this is from Rotten Tomatoes. And on the vertical axis, we have the audience ranking, okay, the score as per the audience. And on the horizontal axis, we have the score as per the critics. Okay, so the more a dot is to the right, the more the critics liked it. The more a dot is to the left, the more the critics did not like it. The higher a dot is, the more the audience liked it, and the lower a dot is, the less the audience liked it. So if we imagine a diagonal line, right, that goes from bottom left to top right, okay, any dots along that line, it means that the audience and the critics pretty much agree. And anything above that line means the audience liked it more than the critics. Anything below that line, that diagonal line, means the critics liked it more than the audience. Okay, so what we see here, right, in this top right corner, okay, this is what's, loved, really liked by the critics and the audience. We have the whole Lord of the Rings trilogy. Okay, so really liked it, okay, 80s, 90s in terms of scores. And very close to that, we have Game of Thrones, right? That's the gray dot. Okay, Lord of the Rings films is the yellow, by the way. The gray dot there, that's Game of Thrones. The black dot beside it, that's House of the Dragon. Okay, so what we see is Lord of the Rings, which is the first films that came out in these fantasy films, TV shows that we're talking about. Okay, they create this gold standard, and Game of Thrones is in that category as well, ranked a little bit lower than Lord of the Rings by both audience and critics, but really it's such a small difference. It's not really meaningful. And then we see House of the Dragon is right there, right next to Game of Thrones. Again, ranked a little bit lower, but it's not really a meaningful difference. Okay, so House of the Dragon really meets the mark in terms of the standards set by Game of Thrones, and it pretty much, a little bit behind, but pretty much meets the marks instead of like a gold standard for fantasy series, which was set by Lord of the Rings. Okay. In terms of the J.R.R. Tolkien universe, okay, when we look at the Hobbit films, they're a bit behind this group right here with Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon. The audience liked it a little bit more than the critics, although both ranked them a bit lower than these high scores right here. Okay, so when we look at audience score, it's like 70s, 80s. So the audience liked it quite a bit, but they didn't think it was amazing like these two Lord of the Rings films, but they did like it quite a bit. Whereas the critics thought, well, it's okay, right? Critics, it's kind of in the 60s, 70s. Critics thought, well, it's okay, right? But the audience did like it more. And when we look at Rings of Power, it's way down here, okay? It's in a whole category of its own, right? If we were to create kind of visual groups here, there's one corner right here, then this little line formed by The Hobbit, and then Rings of Power is all on its own right here. So the critics, well, they liked it as much as House of the Dragon, okay? Comparable to House of the Dragon, right? Comparable to Game of Thrones. So critics actually thought it was pretty good. Quite good, right? In the 80s. Whereas the audience, well, we're looking at 40%, okay? So the audience really didn't like it, okay? It's pretty kind of divided, right? Because 40%, well, that's close to 50. So there was a substantial portion of the audience that did like it, but there was a larger portion of the audience that did not like it, right? So it is ranked pretty low, right? More people disliked it than liked it. And what's interesting, so comparing specifically House of the Dragon to Rings of Power is, again, critics thought the same of both of them, okay? Critics thought both of them were pretty good, but audience have a very different view, okay? The audience for House of the Dragon, they agree with the critics. It's pretty good, right? It's actually quite good. They thought it satisfies the expectations set by Game of Thrones because it's scored very close to Game of Thrones. and it's in this upper group here, quite close, some would say in the same category as that gold standard set by the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Whereas for Rings of Power, audience felt no, it's much lower ranked. It's in a completely different category, lower than Lord of the Rings, lower than The Hobbit, lower than the Game of Thrones and House of the Dragons. So now we can look at the same information, but looking at the Metacritic scores. And Metacritic versus Rotten Tomatoes, the only real difference is actually for House of the Dragon. Other than that, the trends are the same. And we'll see that for Metacritic, in general, the audience and the critics are a little less forgiving. They are more critical. So here's the Metacritic scores. Okay, so you see everything is a little bit farther down or farther to the left, right? When we compare Rotten Tomatoes to Metacritic, right? It's as if like you, it's as if we took these and kind of stretched it down and to the left, right? And that's what we get as a result. But the trends are the same minus House of the Dragons, okay? We still have that gold standard of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, okay? It's ranked very, very high. Audience and critics agree. And Game of Thrones is you know, some would say, I mean, it's kind of in there, but like a little bit lower ranked, right? By both audience and the critics, but it's quite close to that gold standard set by Lord of the Rings. And Hobbit, again, we see the audience like it more than the critics liked it, but both didn't like it as much as the first Lord of the Rings trilogy, right? So audience are giving it like between 7 and 8, right? So they think, oh, it's pretty good, but not amazing, right? Whereas critics, it's kind of in the high 50s, mid 60s. So they're like, it's all right, but not that great, right? And then we see Rings of Power, again, the same trend, right? So the critics think that, well, it's better than The Hobbit, not quite as good as Lord of the Rings, but they give it a 70, so they're saying it's pretty good, right? Just like for Rotten Tomatoes, right? They think, okay, it's better than The Hobbit, not as good as Lord of the Rings, right? Somewhere in between there. And where the difference is House of the Dragon, right? So in Rotten Tomatoes, we saw House of the Dragon ranked very, very similar to Game of Thrones, right up there, close to the Lord of the Rings trilogy. For Metacritic, okay, again, both the audience and the critics felt like, no, you know what, it misses the mark. It's not around Lord of the Rings scale. It's not around Game of Thrones scale. It's on its own, and it's mediocre, right? The audience ranking it like between 5 and 6 out of 10. The critics are saying it's 70. So critics are saying it's pretty good, right? But not that great. Audience are mixed on it. So that's where there's disagreement, right? House of the Dragon is in a different place when you look at Rotten Tomatoes versus Metacritic. What's interesting, though, is specifically comparing House of the Dragons to Rings of Power, we see the exact same trend, whether you're looking at Rotten Tomatoes or Metacritic, okay? The critics rank it the same, and they rank it pretty good, right? So Metacritic, they're both around 70%. Rotten Tomatoes are actually in the mid 80s, right? So on the upper end of pretty good, right? Like quite good. The critics view both of these shows as the same, but the audience view them very differently, right? The audience, they like House of the Dragons much more, okay? Rotten Tomatoes, it's in the 80s versus Rings of Power, which is 40. Metacritic, House of the Dragons is in the 50s, whereas Rings of Power is between 2 and 3, okay? Well, but sorry, I said 50s. It's between 5 and 6, right? In percent, you could say that's like in the 50s. Rings of Power between 2 and 3. In percent, you could say like in the 20s, right? So we actually see that same kind of attitude in comparing the two of them. We also see agreement between audience and critics in terms of House of the Dragon, right? It's close to that diagonal line, right? For both Metacritic and Rotten Tomatoes. And also for both Metacritic and Rotten Tomatoes, Rings of Power is way below that diagonal line, okay? Because the audience liked it much less than the critics did. So it's interesting to see those trends, okay? It's interesting to see them graphically because we can really group these films together, with other films and see, okay, what's actually going on, right? We see there's that corner, there's that gold standard set by Lord of the Rings, and Game of Thrones is pretty close up there. Some would say it's in that category. Some would say it's a little bit removed, but it's up there. Okay, we see The Hobbit to the side here, right? Not quite as great. And Rings of Power we see here down at the bottom. Strong disagreement between audience and critics. Critics liking it more, audience liking it less. And House of the Dragon, well, it's interesting. We see a different trend here in terms of how it compares to Game of Thrones. But we see actually the exact same trend in terms of how it compares to Rings of Power. Critics like it just as much, and audience agree with the critics about House of Dragons that it's quite good or pretty good, but they disagree with Rings of Power and ranking it much lower. So I hope that's fun for you, seeing the reviews scores graph like this, and I'll see you next time.